Notre Dame fans, welcome back to another edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast. This is a special NFL Draft edition of the Irish Breakdown Podcast, and we are joined by Ryan Roberts, the Director of Scouting at the NFL Draft Bible, also one of the hosts of the Locked On Irish podcast. So, Ryan, thanks again for being with us. Yesterday, as you see, Ryan's got his nice little Notre Dame shirt on because he is a Notre Dame fan like me, but also a very good analyst and a very fair analyst. So we are going to dive in today to talk about Notre Dame's draft prospects for the 2021 NFL Draft. So I think it's fair to say, Ryan, that there's really only four former Notre Dame defenders that are really draft candidates this year. That would be Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah at linebacker, Daelin Hayes at defensive end, Adetokunbo Ogundeji at defensive end, and then McCloud at corner. Would you say that's accurate as far as the legitimate draft prospects for this class?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially with, Kyle Hamilton only being a sophomore. We're going to talk a whole lot about him next year. The two defensive linemen, Heinisch and Myron, going back. Those are the guys. And I know, it's not the most depth of all time, obviously, for a draft class. But, I mean, right at top with a guy like Jeremiah, lot to be excited about. So still a really fun class and a lot of things to digest on this end, too.
And obviously, depending on how you look at it, it's not a big draft class. And you'd say, well, that means that's pretty good for the Notre Dame defense in 2021.
That's very true. That's very true. A lot coming back.
I'm curious to see who we're going to be talking about next year. Like, we're obviously going to be talking about Kyle Hamilton and, Drew White, if he can be a late round guy. And then obviously the two defensive tackles. But I'm really curious to see if we're going to be talking about guys like Isaiah Foskey. Some of those potential breakout players. So that's what's going to make this spring and summer and next season fun for Notre Dame. But today we are going to focus on the draft. And so let's kick things off, Ryan, by talking about Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. And we're going to dive into his game and we're going to talk about where you see him in the draft. But I thought it was interesting to point out that the last time you're 29 years old, right? You're cool with me telling everybody that, right?
Yep.
That means the last time that Notre Dame had an off-ball linebacker get drafted in the first round of the NFL draft, you were not even born. I'm in my 40s. I was 4 years old. That was 1982 when Bob Crable, an off-ball linebacker, was drafted in the first round. Now, you and I talked about this off the air. If Jalen Smith doesn't get hurt against Ohio State, he's not only in the first round, he's a top 5 to 10 pick, right?
Absolutely.
But it's still, even if you include him, that's not a lot of linebackers going in round one. So Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is getting a lot of round one love. When you have broken him down over the last couple of years, obviously strength number one is he's from Virginia. As I've established on this podcast for a long time, that's where the real ballers are from. No offense. But when you dive into the tape, what do you see from him? And what are the strengths he has as a player, but also more so, how does his game translate to the National Football League?
Yeah, I think it's a great conversation, especially with the long, sequence of linebackers for Notre Dame not being selected in the first round. I think partly that's due to the fact of like, hey, this, the position, I think it's unfair to a degree because I still value a dominant second level defender, but to a degree, linebackers are becoming devalued in how the game is played today in the NFL. You really need a special player that can impact the pass game and the run game equally. There's not those two down thumpers as much as they once were. But when you look at a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, obviously former safety, moving into that rover position. And is it fair to call him actually a linebacker? That's, I think, the starting point because he is playing an overhang position, which in the NFL doesn't really exist anymore. Because usually you're taking that Sam linebacker, you're gonna flex him in between the tackle and the number two receiver in the apex. Like that's kind of like the spot that he's playing in the NFL. Now you're taking that player out of the game in most instances, and you're bringing in a nickel, right? So like that position is not very translatable. But what makes you so excited about a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is I think it goes into the positionless football moniker that Matt Rule is trying to really establish in the Carolina Panthers. Is he a perfect fit as a will linebacker? Maybe not. Is he a perfect fit as a strong safety? Maybe not. But what Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah is athletically is a outstanding athlete in short spaces. He's shown the ability to play some man-to-man coverage. He's shown the closing speed to blitz from various spots. He's shown just that closing speed in general to really come up in short zones. Like there is so much to like, and there's such a dynamic element to him. I think that he is going to be heavily valued in the first round, just because whether you want to try to label him again as a safety, as a linebacker, wherever you want, I'm going to call him a dynamic second level defender. And I'm going to figure out where he fits best. And I know a lot of NFL teams are going to be scared a little bit just because is he a perfect fit in a spot? But I think for a creative defensive coordinator, they are going to just be enthralled with the positionless type of aspect that Jeremiah brings to the game. It's similar to Isaiah Simmons last year out of Clemson. Now, obviously, different body types. Isaiah's a much longer guy, but it's the same kind of profile. It's the same prototype. Those guys aren't going to fit perfectly into any spot, but you're going to put them on the second level of defense, and you're going to take advantage of their athletic skill set and in different mismatch situations. Because in such a mismatch league that it has become now, guys that are able to play man-to-man against safeties, play man-to-man against slot receivers, like those players that can eliminate those perceived matchup advantages, I think is so invaluable in this ever-evolving passing league.
So when you look at a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, could there be a chance where maybe his talent grade and where he gets drafted are different? Because what I'm hearing from you is, and we've seen this in the NFL, I think we saw this with Isaiah Simmons a little bit last year. Now, he still went in the top 10, but went a little lower than a lot of people were projecting, and that was sort of that knock on him. Do you see a scenario where, like, you could say, for example, where do you have him kind of just from a pure talent standpoint? Is he top 10, top 15, top 20, top 25? Where do you kind of see him slotting in this draft, just from a pure talent player type of situation?
We have him as a top 20 player, and I'm very on board with the conversation. The spot that just keeps flashing to me, I know they moved back a couple spots with the playoffs, but if he somehow gets to the Cleveland Browns, I feel like that's the floor to where he goes, because they have a bunch of guys like the Jacob Phillips from LSU last year and Mac Wilson, who are a little bigger body guys. To have a guy like him that kind of couples with that size, for me, the Cleveland Browns are the floor, but I think he's a top 20 player. Maybe the Las Vegas Raiders would be an absolute dynamite fit, I think, too. So I think top 20 player, probably the floor is the Cleveland Browns in worst case scenario.
Do you think there's a scenario in which he could slide more because of what you talked about? There's going to be some, because let's be honest, right? What we're seeing in the NFL and in college to a degree is offensively, there's a lot of these really young minds. And they're innovative, and they're not stuck in the traditional, you have to play the game this way, this way, this way. We're not seeing that trend as much on defense. We're still seeing that, to me, there's still a lot of older, been in the league a while type of defensive coordinators. We're starting to see a little bit of an influx of some new blood. And I think a guy like Todd Bowles, kind of being that middle ground between those two, having success this year with Tampa Bay could help that. But do you think that there is still some of that in the NFL? Could that cause him to maybe fall? Are you concerned that maybe he might fall a little bit? Because let's just say the Browns are sitting there and you say that's the floor, but you and I both know if somebody else falls that the Browns valued higher at a position, then they're going to take that guy. That's usually how the draft board works. And so is because of that not every team is willing to take a positionless football player. Is there a chance for a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, more a defensive end, a defensive tackle, a corner, to fall because of that? He doesn't necessarily have here's the position you can plug him in and play.
I think it's always possible. I think that there's, it's a great point that you haven't seen that trend of young defensive minds as much as you've seen offensively. But I feel like in this stage, trying to keep up with those offensive minds, like, you need to change with the times, or else you're going to get cast to the wayside. Like, that's not like how you play. You can't get stuck in the mindset where this is what I've been doing for the longest time, and I don't care what offense is doing, because that's how you're going to get beat, every time. You need to really prey on matchups and be able to change with how the times are changing. This isn't where we're going to draft a big-bodied linebacker that can't move in space. Like, that guy just isn't as valuable anymore. So I think, and especially in this draft where we have Micah Parsons, who's an assumed top 10 pick out of Penn State, and there's a lot of good linebackers. I really think it's one of the more underrated classes. I think the linebacker have a lot of guys like Nick Bolton from Missouri and Baron Browning from Ohio State. And there's a lot of dudes that you get really excited about. Zaven Collins from Tulsa. But for me, there is a significant drop off from number one, Micah Parsons, to the next guy. And I truly do believe that the NFL is going to value Jeremiah maybe as that second linebacker just because of what the upside is athletically. Because for like a Zaven Collins, who's like that true 4-3 Sam backer that can come up and play some on ball, and even a Nick Bolton, who's a little undersized and maybe not the most rangy player of all time, like those guys are a little more limited than a guy like Jeremiah. I think a guy like Owusu-Koramoah, the NFL really is going to value, because although every defensive coordinator is not completely, enthralled in the positionless football moniker, I do think that seeing a guy like him on the second level and ability to create matchups that are advantageous for your best football, I think it's going to be I think it's going to be very valuable. And I think that Jeremiah I would be very surprised if he dropped any further than top 25, to be honest.
Now, kind of big picture, when you look at a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah coming a year after Isaiah Simmons,
Yep.
are those the kind of guys that can be sort of needle movers for the league in that if you can invest a first-round pick in those guys and then use them in a way that's not traditional and then see them have success, I kind of view them as like potential door openers.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And there's going to be an influx of safeties that really aren't safeties that now can maybe find a home in the NFL that otherwise would have been without a position because they weren't necessarily safeties, but they also weren't linebackers. Do you think a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and then of course the year before with Isaiah Simmons, do you think they can be sort of game changers in the NFL? Not so much from you've established that you think as a football player he's a game changer for the 60 minutes, between the sidelines and the end zones, but can he be sort of a big picture needle mover for the league in that if he is successful, there's going to be a lot of teams that passed on him that said, boy, we need to now rethink the next time the next Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah comes along.
Yeah, I think they're changing the prototype. Absolutely. I think this is where the NFL is going, because we have seen, hey, defensive linemen, some of these defensive tackles who are these incredible athletes were at one point big body defensive end edge players that have gotten bigger and evolved into their body in this passing league. Defensive ends are more athletic than they ever have been, more flexible, longer athletes. We've seen the evolution of defensive back with cornerbacks in the nickel position. The one position that has not developed as far as the defensive line and defensive backs to this instance in the NFL is the second level. It's the linebackers. That is still trying to figure it out. And in this matchup league, I think that any player, and this is going to Jeremiah, what I think is one of his best strengths, any second level defender, whether you're talking about your traditional linebacker, or you're even talking about a nickel, if you want to couple them in, an overhang, whatever you want to call them, for those slot defenders and off-ball linebackers, for me, anybody that can play man-to-man coverage is going to be a huge asset and a huge bonus. And for me, I look at Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah with the ability to not only man up against some bigger slot receivers, some tight ends, some smaller slot receivers. Like we saw instances this year where that guy is out on an island against some of the quicker slot receivers that he's facing, and he's blanketing them. And for me, at worst, I think that he is a undersized Sam backer in the vein of a Shaq Thompson, how they employ him in Carolina, where, hey, he's not the perfect size, he's not prototype, but what he can do is he can match up against tight ends. He can match up man-to-man against running backs coming out of the backfield. Like, those guys are negators. I think that Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah fits that archetype, and I think the NFL wants to play more man-to-man coverage than ever before, and having the second-level defenders that you can keep in the football game as much as possible to play man-to-man, like a Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, I think is more valuable than it ever has been.
I think the thing that stands out to me, too, when I watch him play is, you see the athleticism. That's easy to spot. I think the thing that surprised me more than anything was his striking power. For a guy that's 210 to 215 pounds, his striking power, and not just, a lot of guys can get a 15, 20-yard head start and drill somebody. His ability to take 3 steps and drill somebody is exceptional. And I think that's going to be something that you're going to see a lot of defensive coordinators look at and say, okay, yeah, he's not big, but it's kind of like the Jonathan Vilma, the Deion Jones, these guys that aren't huge guys, but they have striking power, which means they'll be able to tackle running backs if they need to. They'll be able to physically take down a tight end in space, which, that's where you kind of get into those mismatches of if you try to put your 240-pound linebacker on my back or my slot or my tight end, he may be a great tackler, but he's never going to be in position to tackle. If you put a safety on him, That guy's not big enough or strong enough to handle him. So I think that's something that has always stood out to me about his game is, yes, he's 215 pounds, and he's never going to be a guy that you're going to want to be in the box taking on guards, in the B gap all day. But his striking power against ball carriers is really exceptional when you consider his size.
And I think that you always talk about interior offensive lineman with this moniker, the ability, and interior defensive lineman too, the ability to create power in such short spaces and tight windows. For me, Jeremiah is able to create a ton of pop and a ton of power in a very short amount of space. And that obviously goes into his change of direction, his short area quickness. All those things are exceptional. I think what really helps Jeremiah also, even though he's not going to play the same role as a Darius Leonard for Indianapolis, but him coming out and telling everybody that he played at 215 pounds this year helps Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah because you see that it can be done. It's scary, just like off the top of your head, saying, wow, an off-ball linebacker that's only 210 to 215 pounds. But now that we've seen it happen, it's now maybe not an outlier anymore. Maybe moving forward, this is just the archetype instead of being an outlier. And now it kind of paves the way. You talked about Isaiah Simmons. Also, Darius Leonard, I think, is in that conversation of guys that are changing how the NFL does things.
That's the fun thing about following football. Here's my small little tangent is what's going to happen is you're going to see guys like Jeremiah Owusu you're going to see a lot of safeties get converted to these kind of players, and then the league is going to get smaller. And then in 5 to 8 years, we're going to see offensive teams start drafting more running backs, more big linemen, and you're going to start seeing more 2 tight end sets to say, hey, look, they're putting a bunch of midgets on the field, a bunch of 210 pounders. So let's just run it down their throat. That's what I love about the NFL, is to see this evolution of it. And it's going to take one team that's going to say, let's go get 2 tights and let's, get a 225-pound back like Derrick Henry and let's just run it down their throat. So if the Titans go out and win a Super Bowl next year with Derrick Henry running for 2,200 yards, now all of a sudden, the 4-3 linebacker is going to become vogue again. And that's kind of the fun. And I think that's also for guys like you, that's got to kind of keep it fresh, to kind of have to always be staying up with the trends of the league, because that's going to go into when you're projecting the draft. It's not just about looking at, I rank this guy number 5. That doesn't mean he's going to go number 5. What are the trends? What are the needs? So teams are moving to this, which means they need more of that, which means we're going to see a lot of these guys get taken earlier maybe than normal. That's got to be kind of challenging for you in what you do, but also, so I would imagine, part of the fun of what you do.
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely fun, me being like a younger guy still, because I'm a football junkie. I have a coaching background too, where I just love watching film and seeing different schemes that are kind of evolving and becoming the norm of trends around the league. And I know that one thing that always stuck with me is Lance Zierlein a few months ago of NFL.com. He on a podcast, he basically said, like, people all have scouting biases when they watch the game. It's what they fall into, and that's what they become used to. It's being aware of those biases. So for me, it's just always being aware of, hey, this is what I like, and this is where the NFL is, but it's not going to stay this way forever. There's going to be evolution, and there's also going to be a cyclical nature to a degree too. Like you're saying, like, we're going to get back to the power running scheme at some point. Like, it's going to happen. It's just being aware of what the trends are and how the game is evolving, and my favorite thing, actually, Bryan, I would say, is trying to forecast what the next thing is. Like, that's, for me, is what really is a lot of fun. Like, I believe that over the next 5 years or so, like, we've already seen it to a degree, every team is going to want that center fielder, free safety, that has that insane range, and everybody wants to play man-to-man underneath all the way across the board. And that's why I value a guy like J.C. Horn this year out of South Carolina, the cornerback, heavily, because he's a guy that wherever the number 1 receiver is lined up, whether they're trying to get him off the line of scrimmage or trying to get him on the line of scrimmage as an X receiver into the boundary, whatever it is, he can go with that guy because he's experienced both inside in the slot and on the outside. That is a matchup negator. And for me, that is where the NFL is moving. And that is the most fun part for me, is it's kind of projecting where it's going to go, because some things you can kind of project pretty easily, but then there's a lot of things where you're just kind of keeps you guessing, which is a whole lot of fun.
So I'm going to try to get you back on the show after the draft, and we're going to kind of take a look at the 2022 Notre Dame prospects. But I'm going to interject Kyle Hamilton into that because of what you just said. That's why I think he's going to make a ton of money next year.
So much
because he is, to me, the prototype safety. If you can find a guy like him, and they're rare, you want him, because here's the thing. He could be that center fielder you're talking about. I don't know if there's a safety with more range than Kyle Hamilton. And Alabama learned that. We talked in our last show that Alabama threw the ball beyond 20 yards once. No, we actually talked about, I think, off the air. Alabama threw the ball beyond 20 yards once, and there were two reasons for that. Reason number one is they were concerned about the Notre Dame pass rush. Reason number two is Kyle Hamilton almost picked off the one pass that they threw, and he should not have been there.
It was insane.
When you watch that play develop in the all 22, you're like, that's a big play. And then he had to kind of slow up as the ball was coming because he almost got there too soon. And you're like, I don't know if there's another safety in the country that could have made that particular play. But the other thing too is he's 6'4", 215 pounds. He can be that alley safety, that guy that can almost play a Jeremiah Owusu role as well. And so to me, it doesn't matter what defense you run, what coverage you run. Everyone's going to say, yeah, we can find a home for that guy in our defense. And that's why I think Kyle Hamilton's a guy that's going to be, barring injury or him taking a step back, which I don't see him taking a step back with the way he works. He's a guy that is going to be a very, very intriguing player heading into next year's draft.
Well, he's somebody that, I mean, I joked about it on the podcast, somewhat half serious though. I'll be very honest with you. Like when they're playing against Alabama and Devonta Smith is in the slot and he's doing whatever he's doing. Like I'm almost to the degree where like, hey, if I had 10, 11 Kyle Hamiltons, I would be set to go because I would just throw Kyle Hamilton right there in the slot and he would be that guy working inside out, not Sean Crawford. Like he's your matchup guy, no matter what you want him to do. And that play you're talking about where they ran, I think it was just like a little fake bubble wheel, right? And they were trying to hit Slade Bolton up the sideline. That play, because I think they were playing some sort of cover three. It was like a match three type of look. And that closing speed for 6'4", 215, 220, like you're talking about, is insane. Like, I mean, there's no word, and I can't quantify it really in words because you watch that and you're like, wow, that was a really good play by the safety. And then it comes into your mind that was 6'4", 220 pounds moving like that. And I'll be very honest, like this is hyperbole to agree, but like Sean Taylor entered my mind immediately. And I'm like, I haven't seen a guy that big, that athletic move like that in so long. And I actually, I didn't want to put this out too much, but I actually already graded Kyle Hamilton. He's obviously not draft eligible, but I just wanted to see how he looked on my grading scale. And I don't think I'm willing to put it out on air yet, but I will say that he graded out quite high to just put it lightly there.
Yeah, he really is an exceptional talent. And again, he's just a true sophomore. So his game is still very much evolving. So he's a very talented player. When you look at let's go down and let's talk some big boys now. Okay. Let's start off with Daelin Hayes. We're going to continue the theme of versatile players, right? To me, Dalen Hayes is an intriguing guy. I saw that you guys on your NFL Draft Bible, which you can find, I believe it's si.com/NFL/draft, I believe is how you guys can find your website. You guys are part of the SI Fan Nation brand as well. So you guys had Daelin Hayes listed as a 4-3 defensive end. I could see that. I personally believe he's more of a 3-4 outside linebacker, and I would imagine there's a lot of NFL teams having this same discussion, the same debate. How do you see Daelin Hayes best? Like, can he play 4-3 end, number one? Can he play 3-4 outside linebacker, number two? And then the third part of my question for you is, Ryan, where do you see him having the highest ceiling as a player at the next level between those two positions?
I think that Dalen could play either. I personally do prefer him in a 3-4 like you're talking about, but of course, we're talking through the scouting department, we're talking to the talking heads around the league, and I know that some people prefer him in a 4-3, some prefer him in a 3-4. For me, Dalen, the versatility aspect, I think that really shows in that just having that conversation about it to begin with. Now, obviously, he was a guy that was recruited as an off-ball, right, as an inside linebacker, and then he made that transition. I will say that he, for me, is a 3-4 outside linebacker. He's a Sam backer that is going to flex out, going to play a little more in space, be able to play from depth a little bit, but also be able to come on ball in passing situations and then, affect the passer. What didn't really strike you on film, obviously, Dalen was a guy that had a lot of notoriety and a lot of hype early and then kind of just fell into that backup role because, hey, there was a lot of talented players on the roster as well, right? Like Julian Akwara and Khalid Kareem, a lot of talent, a lot of guys that are going to play in the NFL one day. So he kind of fell into a backup role, and then he came back, fortunately, for this year, and he had some flashes. I feel like his best stuff was playing that overhang and being able to close a lot on some screens and some short flat routes and doing different things like that. But then he goes to Senior Bowl and he dominates one-on-ones throughout most of the week. And he's not a guy that won the weigh-in because you didn't expect him to. He measured in exactly how I pictured him, but showing a pass rush profile, which was very up and down during his time at Notre Dame, I think helps him big time. But then also when you couple that with, hey, the last time we saw Daelin Hayes, he was dominating one-on-ones, but then when you pop on the film and he's doing a lot of different things for Notre Dame, that versatility to me is 3-4 Sam backer, playing outside, playing some on ball, playing off ball, playing some overhang. I think that there's so many possibilities for Dalen. I do think that he can play in a 4-3 because I think that, pass rush is always very important to the next level. But I think versatility is what he brings to the table that evaluators like the most.
It's interesting. We talked in the offensive show about Ian Book and what he sees in practice. The one thing about Dalen Hayes that I've always heard from talking to offensive linemen and people associated with the Notre Dame offense is Dalen's been doing that his whole career. He dominates in one-on-ones. I mean, I've been told that since he was a freshman. It just never translated onto the field really until the second half of this past season is really, I mean, he started to kind of ramp up the ability to get after the quarterback. We saw him with a big sack against Clemson. He had a couple big sacks against Georgia Tech. You just kind of wonder because look, this is a kid that played 8 games of high school football. That's it. 8 games of high school football. And so I think the 5-star ranking that he had was, I think, put more on him than he was ready to handle just from an experience standpoint. And so his game is interesting. And I also wondered too, Ryan, do you think his size has some automatically kind of pigeonholing him into a 4-3 defensive end as opposed to watching, like you said, if you didn't really watch him at Notre Dame, which is understandable. I think when a lot of people popped on the film, they were probably watching number 6 or number 14. If you really start to focus on the film, you see this really versatile guy. He's a really good run defender, really good at setting the edge, really good in backside pursuit, good in coverage, can cover tight ends, can cover backs, things like that. And then you see him at the Senior Bowl, and you're like, whoa, this guy's, he's got it's got to be his repertoire needs to be expanded a little bit, but he's got the physical tools to be a really good pass rusher, really good burst off the edge, really loose athlete that can do spin moves and double moves that if he can kind of get coached up to do. I think that the fact he was so versatile in Notre Dame, there was no need to teach him an expanded pass rushing repertoire because you weren't going to ask him to rush a passer enough to where that was worth the practice investment. Does an NFL 4-3 team say, hey, we want to put him there, or a 3-4 outside linebacker will take advantage of his versatility? But I often wonder if, his size is something that maybe starts to get some before they really dive into the film to kind of pigeonhole into, hey, he's an end. He's a 4-3 end as opposed to, I think his film tells a different story.
I think the tough part is when you're talking about NFL football now, I mean, there's like 1 or 2 football teams that play base defense over 50% of the time, right? So even if I'm classifying them as a 3-4 or 4-3 ends, like we're seeing across the NFL, you're on an even man front majority of the time. So 3-4, like you can say it out loud to yourself, but in reality, it is not the 3-4 of the, it's not the Steelers of the 90s.
And it's not Lawrence Taylor and Carl Banks with the Giants of people my age, right? It's a different deal, but I kind of feel like even as a 3-4 outside linebacker, when you're in your 4 down front, you're still going to need to be doing a lot of the things that he did because he was a defensive end at Notre Dame. He wasn't an outside linebacker, but he never put his hand in the ground. He was, and I think that's kind of the new age usage of the 3-4 outside linebackers. You have to be able to rush the quarterback. But, we saw from Dalen is he could rush the quarterback inside, outside. Some of his best pass rushes in his career were inside pass rushes where he was standing up over a guard. I believe that's against Clemson in the November 7th. That's where he had his big sack is he just beat a guard. And so, it's just kind of having that versatile player. And we saw this a little bit, I think, from Tampa Bay in the Super Bowl. I mean, there were times where they really had 3 defensive linemen and really in the game, the whole game. But they were bringing guys from all over, and then it's just an interesting thing. Cause as you said, I think I read somewhere that like over 60% of the time NFL teams are in some sort of sub package. I mean, your college football is getting to that point a little bit with some teams, but that's an insane number. I mean, so like you said, you're just not lining up in your 2-gap 3-4 anymore, and then maybe having a nickel package. But Does that add value to a guy like Daelin Hayes, that he can kind of be that versatile within those kind of that scheme versatility?
I mean, I think so. Absolutely. I think though, what is really going to, I mean, so if this was me, if I was Dalen's perspective, pass rushers get paid, right? So like, I want to prove that I can be that guy, whether it's rushing out of a 2-point or a 3-point stance, whatever it is. I want to be that sack guy. Because I remember like when Conor Barwin was on the Philadelphia Eagles for a couple years, right? He had one insane year where he had like 14 or 15 sacks, but he was actually better the next year playing that Sam role in their 3-4. And he only had like 5 sacks the next year, but he was just doing things against screen, playing a little overhang, playing off ball at points. Like he was doing a lot of versatile things that was actually more valuable to the football team than the year before. So I think that the ability to have everything and to be able to add the value to yourself, the more you can do, is always better. But for right now, I think Daelin, what he really needs to prove is, hey, I can be a pass rusher first. I can be a volume sack guy potentially down the road. I'm a guy that's just still scratching into the surface. Because like you said, I mean, 8 football games coming out of Skyline High School. And now he's, he was up and down a little bit, especially, kind of sitting behind a couple guys after losing the starting nod, early on in his career. So he's a guy that's still relatively inexperienced when you really think about it, which for NFL evaluators is both good and bad, because they're going to think, hey, maybe we don't get the immediate return, but down the line, Dalen Hayes hasn't even scratched the surface. So he might be worth the investment. It might not be this year, but 2 to 3 years from now, we could be having some sort of high volume sack guy, at least a guy that can contribute a ton on passing downs and give us that impact that we need.
Where do you rank him as far as draft range, and where do you think he goes in this upcoming draft?
I am a little higher on both the defensive end edge players coming out of Notre Dame this year than we are consensus in NFL Draft Bible. I would say that I have early day 3 grades on both the guys. I was on record on Locked On Irish, as I said, that I thought that at least one of those guys would push into day 2 consideration after the Senior Bowl. And I think, honestly, both of them, I know we didn't get into Adi yet, but I think both of them did, in different ways, a lot of service to themselves. I wouldn't be shocked if both of them ended up going on day 2 somewhere, because I think there's developmental potential to both of them.
Now, just for the people that aren't draft nicks like you are, and like I love the draft. Day 1 is first round. It's not like it used to be, where it's just kind of one day, and it's not even 2 days anymore. It's now 4, right? 3 or 4 days. Day 1 is round 1. Day 2 is round 3 and 4, or 2 and 3, correct?
Yep,
and then
2 and 3,
right.
And 4 through 7.
Right. So that's the deal. So if he's a day 2 guy, he's a 2nd or 3rd round pick, which I think would be the top. I mean, that's the highest he's going to go.
Yes.
So you started to get into Adetokunbo Ogundeji a little bit, and he's a really interesting player. Complete opposite of Daelin Hayes, in that he was a guy that Notre Dame flipped from Western Michigan. I think he's about 215 pounds, 6'4". He's always been super long. 6'4", about 215 pounds. They flipped him from Western Michigan. He was just starting to get some D1 looks. Pitt had offered him. I think Oregon had offered him. And then Notre Dame, this was actually Keith Gilmore at the time, went and got him. And he was part of that vaunted 2016 class, which I believe is going to have 4 defensive ends from that class. They're going to end up being drafted into the NFL, because Julian Ekwara, Khalid Kareem, Daelin Hayes, and Adetokunbo Ogundeji were all in the same draft, the same recruiting class for Notre Dame. That was a 2016 class. Was another guy that was a really good backup for multiple years. I remember the 2018 game against Clemson. Julian Ekwara got hurt and came off the field, and it was a 3rd down. Still in the first half. The game was still in doubt. And so they brought out Adetokunbo off the bench, and he sacks Trevor Lawrence and knocks him out of field goal range. So he's always been kind of that flashy guy. Late in the 2019 season, he was Notre Dame's best defensive lineman by far. And again, Ekwara was out, Dalen was out, Khalid Kareem was playing on one shoulder, and they needed him to step up, and he stepped up. He had a huge game against Boston College, but they didn't stop there. He was really good against Iowa State. He was really good against Stanford. And I think he carried it over. He, to me, had one of the quietest, outstanding seasons I've seen in a long time at a place like Notre Dame. Usually when a guy's even decent, he gets way overhyped at a place like Notre Dame. We saw that on the other side of the ball for Notre Dame. But for him, it's just kind of like, because he didn't have, I don't think he necessarily had the sexy tackle numbers, or tackle for loss numbers. But to me, when I graded him out, Ryan, and I'm just going to give my thoughts, I want to hear if you agree or disagree. I thought he was about as steady as you could be as a defensive end. His ability to set the edge against the run is tremendous. And we saw it all week at the Senior Bowl as well. And then he had a quiet 7 sacks. I mean, when you look, you're like, the one against Clemson, but like, okay, when did he have the other 7 sacks? He had a quiet 7 sacks. And, I just think he's a really, really solid, steady player. What do you see from Adetokunbo Ogundeji? What are the traits that you like the most about him? What are the things that NFL teams do you think are going to be really attracted to him as a player?
Well, I'll say first and foremost, we actually had Adi come on the Locked on Irish podcast, and I will say just from a person perspective, awesome young man. I mean, you could tell that he is a worker, to say the least. And he won the Senior Bowl the minute that he weighed in. Like, let's be honest. Over 6'4", 35+ inch arms. Like, that's how you draw it up, man. Like, that is.
Well, let's put that into perspective, because I believe Khalid Kareem had the longest arms of any defensive end at the combine last year, and I think he was like 34 3/8,
something like that. Yeah.
Adetokunbo was over 35 inches, so almost a full inch longer than the guy who had the highest, another Notre Dame guy, the highest at the entire combine. So not just Senior Bowl where it's a lower number. The entire combine, Khalid Kareem had, I believe, the longest arms of all the ends. And then Adetokunbo was significantly longer. That is some impressive length. Now, here's my question. I want you to explain to people, why is that important for a defensive end?
I mean, so we talked a little bit about it on the offensive tackle show. Like, we're dealing with length on the edge in a lot of space. Like, it's not inside an offensive guard or center where you have help and you're in a condensed space. At offensive tackle, you're working on an island against some of these pass rushers. And for a defensive end that is like Adi, the ability to get inside of an offensive tackle, press, and then create separation at the top of the track, like, that is what you want. And that's the ability to really just use your length to your advantage and gain extension both in the run game and in the pass game. So that is, I mean, you always hear like the long arm, right? Like, guys are getting in their body, they're long arming dudes. That's why, because a lot of instances, one arm is longer than two. So the minute that you can get in the middle of an offensive tackle's chest or play half-man relation, you can get inside of him and you can keep him off your body. So when you have 35+inch arms like Adi has, then you're talking about gaining extension in the run and the pass game, and that is a hard guy to deal with one-on-one, because, I mean, that's the name of the game. It's a numbers game at the end of the day. Defensive ends are playing in a lot more space. They're in most times in one-on-one situations against offensive tackles if you're not getting chipped or there's not a running back that's keeping an eye out for you type of situations. But that's why the length is so important, because you're working in a whole ton more space. The minute that you can gain a little bit of separation, gain extension, then it's a hard thing to deal with one-on-one. And for having 35+inch arms, I mean, the minute I saw it, because I expected him to be like in the 34 something ballpark. It's like you could watch him on film and see like that. I mean, the guy's a pterodactyl. Like, he has that look to him. But 35+inch arms is rare. So now we're talking about rare length with a guy that had a nice season, but has continued to get better and better as a guy that is growing into his body. And it wasn't perfect in Mobile at every rep, as it shouldn't be. But you saw just the glimpses. And I think there's still a power profile that needs to improve with a guy like Adi. When you add that power profile to that type of length and the type of athleticism he has, then we're talking about a high upside guy. Like, I'm hopeful that Dalen Hayes can be a high volume sack guy eventually. It's not as likely, though, as it is with a guy like Ogundeji, because he is still tapping into that potential. And he has the traits, the thresholds that you always talk about in scouting circles. He has that at a position, defensive end and offensive tackle specifically, where it matters more than any position on the football field.
Now, I see him as a pure edge player, but I'm reading, and you and I had this, I'm bringing this up because you and I had this conversation off the air. I'm reading person after person of draft analysts, and I should probably use air quotes for that one, but I'm seeing all these people talk about him being a defensive tackle. Explain to me where, because he's 255 pounds. Now, I actually think there's another level for him physically. I think he is a guy that probably could get up to 265, 270 at the next level.
Right.
But even then, that's not defensive tackle. Now, and I'm not talking about a guy that on 3rd and 9 could move inside. That's a different deal. But I'm seeing people list him as a defensive tackle and then ranking him as a defensive tackle, a 6'4", 255-pound guy. Explain to me where that comes from, and because I just don't. I mean, these are draft analysts. Where does something like that come from, right? Because I see you kind of shaking your head and rolling your eyes as I'm saying this, because we're on the same page. Like, this is insane, but it's becoming a thing now. You had a guy say to you, "Well, that's what I'm seeing other people list him as." Well, first of all, that's lame. You know what I mean? Be your own man. But number two, what? Defensive tackle?
I think, I mean, one, I don't think people are good at body typing to begin with. You know, they probably saw him rushing inside at the Senior Bowl and said, like, wow, he looks good inside. He looks good. But in reality, like 6'4" plus a little and some change at 255 pounds, like that's not playing inside. Ever.
Right.
Like
that's and that hurt him in the game. We saw that in the game. He got some early down snaps at defensive tackle and he got driven off the ball. That's just that's not who he is.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking to him as a sub-package rusher on third downs, like that's cool. Like I can get on board with that. I think that body typing is a big problem. People don't really understand sometimes. And honestly, I mean, I don't want to be a jerk here, but like I think some people probably haven't watched enough of him to know exactly what his role is and how much he weighs, and they probably haven't done their due diligence on that part. And then some people are saying like, oh, a 3-4 defensive end, he has that length. In theory, I understand where that thought process is going, but I mean, Adi needs to be like 6'6" and have substantial amount more growth. Like he needs to be 280 plus pounds to be able to play that position. Like you said, I think he can get up to 265 pounds. Like that's probably the max where I want him. Because at some point, we talk about all these athletic gifts that he has. If we're putting too much weight on his frame, then you're taking away from what is the biggest selling point for Ogundeji. So you don't want to put too much weight on that frame. I don't understand where that comes from. He's a pure edge guy that for me has some versatility to move inside on third downs. That is the that is the projection for me. I mean, I definitely never want to see him on base downs playing inside. I don't think it's advantageous to what he does well, and I don't think it makes any sense from a schematic perspective.
Unless you're playing a team that just doesn't even try to run the football. I mean, maybe then. But, you'd mentioned, we talked about the size. And look, Adetokunbo Ogundeji, like any defensive lineman, could get up to 290 pounds. I mean, no problem. What we're talking about is what can you do? What can you get up to while maintaining your level of explosiveness and burst and flexibility? The problem is when you get a guy beyond what his body's capable of carrying from an athletic standpoint, what you start to see is he starts to lose some of those things. So the explosiveness, the burst, the flexibility, the foot quickness, those things start to go because your body can only handle a certain way. I mean, you could get a quarterback up to 320 pounds. He's going to play 5 plays, but he's going to, but so that's what we talk about when we talk about the concern of how much more weight do you want to put on him, where you start worrying about losing the athletic profile that makes him the player that he is. And so that's what we're talking about here.
Yeah, and I think that this is a good conversation for body typing. This is a big part of scouting. You need to look at a guy's body and see how much weight they could carry to be comfortable. Specifically, we're talking about skin tightness. We're talking about like how do they look in the lower half? How do they look around their torso? Like the ability to gain weight is a big conversation in scouting departments. I know it's a big conversation right now with Devonta Smith, because Devonta Smith, not to go off tangent here, is, from my understanding, what I'm hearing is he weighed in a couple weeks ago, and this is why he didn't weigh in at the Senior Bowl. He's 164 pounds, and that is troublesome, and that is worrisome. And I know a lot of people are like, oh, he can get up to 180 easy. Well, if you look at him, though, he's got really tight skin. He's got a really thin lower half. Like, where is he putting that weight at, right? Like, and at some point, like you said, he could get up to that weight, but what makes Devonta Smith a special player with an extra 20 pounds on him is going to start to deteriorate and to take away from what makes him a special athlete to begin with. So it's the ability to project how much is good weight for a player without taking away what makes him, to begin with, the baseline athlete that you want him to build off of.
I'd still take him.
I would take him
if too. If you can't catch him, it doesn't matter how much he weighs. You know what I mean? If you reach to press and he ain't there, it doesn't matter how much he weighs. So, but I mean, look, and it's different than college, because in college you can take a chance on a kid. If he doesn't pan out, you can offer a different scholarship kid every year. There's no value in a scholarship independent of other scholarship offers. You know what I mean? In the NFL, there's value to these draft positions. So, that's why you're going to take a guy at a certain spot. I think of the kid that the Raiders drafted out of Clemson a couple years ago. He's a good football player, and he had a much better second year than his first year, but is he ever going to play to the level where that value was where he was picked? Those are the things that NFL teams have to think about when they're talking about taking guys, is the value of it. So if you say, well, Devonta Smith can still be a good NFL receiver. Okay, but is he a good NFL receiver that you would take with the third value, the value of what a third pick is, or the value of what an 18th pick is? And we see this all the time where you'll see a guy that people say, oh, what a great story. This guy had a great year. And you look at his numbers and it's like, well, he had 8 sacks and 12 tackles for loss. And then they're saying this first round pick was pick number 15, who had 9 sacks and 13 tackles for loss, had an okay year. What's the difference? Well, one guy, the expectation is much lower because he was a 5th round pick. The other guy was a number 3 pick in the NFL draft. So that's why these things are important, and why you have to really do your due diligence. It's not just like in college where you can offer 4 Scott receivers a year. You know, there's you miss, especially with the high picks, and there are certain positions where if you miss, you're screwed. If you miss, to me, at the premium positions, quarterback, defensive end, left tackle, you're in trouble. You can go find a 6th round tight end. You know, I mean, we've seen a lot of tight ends turn out. There aren't a lot of Tom Brady's when it comes to quarterbacks. So that's why we have those conversations. So let's wrap up talking about. I personally think, barring as long as the medicals check out, my opinion, again, as a not a draft expert, but my opinion is I think all 3 of those guys we talked about will get drafted somewhere. Adetokunbo, Ogundeji, Daelin Hayes, and Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, barring the medicals checking out. The 4th guy is a bit more of a question mark for me, and I don't think he is to me at this point a draftable guy, but we'll talk about the pro day in a second, and that is cornerback Nick McCloud. Now, he saved Notre Dame's defense in a lot of ways this year. If he doesn't transfer in, I'm concerned about what Notre Dame's defense would have looked like this year at cornerback. Big kid, experienced, veteran kid, tough, competitive, but there's just the athletic profile, Ryan. Talk to me about kind of what you see from Nick McCloud, not so much of what he was at Notre Dame, because he was a good football player at Notre Dame, but how does that project to the next level where, you know, the position he plays, the top level athleticism is so much more important?
Yeah, well, I mean, thank the Lord for Nick McCloud this year, because I can imagine what the cornerback room would have been like for Notre Dame without him there. I mean, yeah, he gave us just kind of a consistent feel at one position, right? Like, he did an excellent job. As far as an NFL projection, I mean, he looks the part. He's got a nice size profile to him. He looks like that traditional press man corner, even cover 3 corner, where like you can get a little excited about it. I really think that there's just a whole lot of limitations to him. You know, he's very tight, doesn't have great quickness, short area quickness. He doesn't have the most flexible hips of all time. So I think that he's a really limited to a zone-based scheme where, hey, if you're playing cover 3 where you have your eyes back towards a quarterback, or some cover 2 systems where like, hey, eye discipline is more important than maybe your physical profile and being an instinctive player, like, he can get by. The good thing that Nick does have going for him is the last time that we are going to see him in the draft process, besides for his pro day at the Hula Bowl, he had 2 interceptions and he was the defensive player of the game, which is awesome. Yeah. That is wonderful.
And they weren't like Larry Smith in the Super Bowl interceptions either, where he was just standing there and the guy threw it to him. Like, he made 2 really great. I think both of them were like him jumping routes and making plays. So they were impressive. Ooh, let me go study some more tape of that type of plays. And that's important to make those in that kind of environment.
Oh, absolutely. Yep. It's paramount because, again, some limitations to this draft process for some guys, less of a resume building process. So how you can gain attention is what Nick McCloud did at the Hula Bowl. So it's awesome. You know, we do scouting seminars with Bryan Baldinger at NFL Draft Bible. So Baldy was announcing the game, which was a lot of fun. Just being able to watch him do that, and the performance that Nick put out there was outstanding. So it's nice to see. I just think that there is a lot of limitations to him. I don't think that he's a coverage versatile player. Like, I do not want him in press or off man. Like, I just don't want it, because the minute that the guy gains a little bit of separation on him, if he has if he has a good release at the line, he doesn't get good hands on him at the line of scrimmage, maybe, you know, his feet are just a little slow to react, then we're in some trouble. Getting him in trail is not a good situation. He needs to have good leverage on a player, and he needs to have eyes towards the line of scrimmage. I think that's where Nick McCloud plays his best football. I think that he's going to be a priority free agent. Like, I think that a team is definitely going to be interested in him. Could he sneak into the 7th? It's possible, just because, hey, he's coming from Notre Dame. He played a bunch at NC State. He had a nice performance in the All-Star circuit. Hopefully he tests relatively well, even though I don't have high expectations for that area for him. So I just think there's a lot of limitations, probably designated as a priority free agent, but I think that so far he has made the most of his draft process to date.
I think you said something that's very interesting. You said you don't have very high expectations of him at the pro day. Notre Dame's pro day will be the end of March. That's an interesting thing for me because that's going to be his opportunity to get drafted, is going to be that right there. Because the thing is, and he doesn't have to necessarily run a blazing low 4.4 time because the expectations are so low. If he can have good agility, and I think that to me is what I'd be more concerned about as an NFL team than necessarily the 40, because corners just don't open up and they don't just run straight lines. It's more of a, you know this, you see on film, you see guys with great 40 times that are bad cover players because their ability to backpedal, open, and run is so bad that they basically play like a 4.6. And there's 4.6 guys, and this is why you talked about agility and foot quickness and being tight, is there's 4.55, 4.6 guys that can just pedal, open, and run like it's just a natural thing for them. They play faster. And so to me, if he can show good agility times and good change of direction stuff and then run a good 40 time, I think that could get him sort of on some teams' draft boards because the expectations are so low. It's like last year, Troy Pride ran a 4.4 flat and people were disappointed, rightfully so, because we were all expecting like a 4.28. Again, that expectation thing is so important because if the bar is set low and then you go out and surpass that, like Miles Boykin did that 2 years ago at the Combine. Nobody thought he was going to be the overall athletic dominance that he had at the Combine. And to me, it boosts the guy that had 6th round film into the 3rd round of the draft. And so that's going to be big for him. We talked about a lot of guys on offense. The pro day is going to be super important for some of those guys. Javon McKinley, Tommy Trumbull. The guy on defense that the pro day is going to me, be almost as I would argue, as far as being able to find a home, is Nick McCloud. I mean, the difference between him being drafted and him being a free agent is going to be what he does at the pro day. What are your thoughts on that, Ryan?
Yeah, well, I think, I mean, it's the full scope of the workout, right? Like, I want to see what those short area numbers are. I want to see what those explosive numbers are. I want to see what he jumps. I want to see everything, lower body explosion. But the thing that I really want to see when we get to positional drills, the line drill where like he's opening up and continuing to open up, that's where you really see where that hip tightness is. So I'm really looking forward to seeing that because I know that he's a competitive player. I know that he has some size to him. It's about the hip flexibility because then if he goes there and he has some hip tightness, then people are going to start saying, hey, is he a safety? Can we work with him there? Is he physical enough to do things in the box? What is the upside there? For me, outside of showing that you're a good enough athlete, it might come down to, and I mean, this usually does for, well, not usually, this does for fringe draftable players or not draftable at all. What is your impact on special teams? That is going to be the biggest thing for a Nick McCloud and something to just keep an eye out for. But if he can test just as a relatively good athlete combined with the Hula Bowl performance and the year that he had at Notre Dame, then we're talking fringe draftable. I just am watching him on film, just seeing some of the hip tightness. I just don't expect a good overall testing performance, which I think people are going to dock him a little bit. But if he surprises there, then we're talking about potentially getting another Notre Dame defender or the fourth guy off the board.
And that's kind of what, to me, a couple of years ago was the difference between Drew Tranquill being a 4th-round pick and Tavon Coney being undrafted. There were some off-the-field things that hurt Tavon, but I remember watching that line drill you were talking about, and I was standing literally on the line, like watching them. They were backpedaling away from me, and Drew Tranquill is just, he's never off the line. He had surprisingly flew loose hips. He was, you saw the former safety. I mean, he was opening and turning. He was staying right. Tavon Coney was zigzagging. Yeah, and that's not what you want. That tells me you're tight. When you open, your body's going to go here because you're tight. Drew Tranquill was just right on that line. And that's the thing for Nick McCloud is, can he open? And that's what I love about watching the NFL Combine too on TV is you see these guys, these corners that are like doing, I'm like, oh, is that the zigzag drill? No, it's not supposed to be. Right. And so that's big for Nick. And here's a question I have for you, because there's always this thought that and I think sometimes it can be misguided, but I think in his case it can apply. There's always this thought, well, if a guy's not athletic enough to play corner, just move him to safety if he's bigger. No, that's not how it works. But Nick McCloud is a guy that I would ask you, if he tests well, not great, but well. Do you think there could be some projectability of him being sort of a nickel defender, a safety kind of guy if the testing is better than we think it's going to be? Because I'm on the same page with you. I don't expect a great performance from him at the combine, but I'd love to be wrong because I was really impressed with Nick McCloud as a young man this year for Notre Dame. The character he showed was like, you listen to people talk about him and those kind of things. To make that kind of an impact in less than a year speaks volumes about who you are as a man. So I think he's going to do well there. But if he tests better, that's my question. Is there some positional flexibility with him if he maybe is a little more fluid and looser and faster than you and I think he's going to be?
So, I mean, to start it off, I mean, there's a whole lot of different roles that safeties can have, right? Like, are we playing a too high system where a guy's playing splitting the fields? Are we playing a single high system in cover 3 or cover 1 where, like, hey, I have a strong safety that's playing mid hole or he's playing curl to flat? Like, is that what he's doing? Is he robbing to the boundary? Like, what is his role that he's going to fit into? I think that some teams will think about it because just simply he's got the size measurables, right? Like, he's not a smaller guy. He has some size to him. Could he play in the box? For me, when I watch Nick, and I don't know if you came away with this same feeling, Brian, I felt like in the run game, I wasn't very
He is
impressed
a
with
lot
him
more physical as a cover player against
in the run game.
receivers than he is. And I think that was incredibly evident against Alabama.
Yes. Yeah.
But he was never, I mean, I honestly, there were times that Tariq Bracy was more aggressive coming down in the run game than he was.
Yeah.
And that's my concern with him is projecting to a safety. Because I don't care, you have to be a good tackler. And so I was not in love with his tackling ability. I think he's better at taking on blocks than he is at making tackles.
Right.
From a physicality standpoint, if that makes sense. And I'm not sure if you agree with that or not.
No, I absolutely do. And I think that comes back to, we talked about length a lot of the body, like the length of the cornerback position. I feel like people always talk about disrupting the catch point, which is obviously very important, but it's also getting off of blocks, gaining extension in the run game and getting off. For me, I was not impressed by Nick as a run defender. And obviously it's a little different from, hey, you're playing, just as a force player on the outside and you're trying to get everything to go back in. Like, I understand that there's very big difference as opposed to working inside out, running the alley. Like, there's a very big difference. So maybe he would be better in that area. For me, I don't think he projects that well to safety, just based upon what I see and what I think that he does well. And then if we're talking about him, hey, if he's a guy that needs to play near the line of scrimmage and needs to play in the slot at times, if he doesn't test well and he has limited hip flexion, like at that point, like you're playing a lot of man coverage anyway. So is that really what the role that you want him to play either? So I think that there isn't a ton of versatility, a ton of projectability to him moving. I think he has to prove that he can stick on the outside, if you're playing a field boundary type of defense, which a lot of NFL defenses don't really run. They play just left or right corner most of the time. But if you're to a team specifically that likes that, hey, we're going to throw that big physical guy into the boundary that needs to be able to be physical, and he's going to be in man one-on-one in a ton of situations. Like, if he could show that he could be that guy, then I can get on board a little bit if he tests relatively well. But I just don't think that he has the traits to be that safety type player that I think could be exposed in a lot of situations.
See, Ryan, that's why I ultimately don't think he's going to get picked, because I think the same things that keep him from projecting to safety are the same things that I don't think project well to special teams.
I don't disagree.
Yeah. I mean, that block destruction, that ability to be fast downfield, to be able to use your length and size to your advantage, I don't see those traits. And I don't see those traits on special teams. I don't see those traits necessarily. I think he's really good at coverage at the college level. But the problem is the physical traits that don't get exposed as much in college are going to get exposed every single day at the NFL level. Notre Dame did not play a lot of great receivers. And when they did, he wasn't often matched up against them because a lot of those teams would move them away from him. He'd be in the slot or they'd be field receivers. He was almost purely a boundary receiver. But he got beat a couple times this year. Not a lot, but there weren't a lot of teams that had the ability to beat him. And to be honest with you, he didn't get beat as much because of the guys we were just talking about earlier. Being able to put pressure on the quarterback. So I think he's going to have to really blow it up at the pro day, like just crush it at the pro day to be drafted, in my view, because he's going to have to show me a level of athleticism that we haven't seen. But I just like Alohi Gilman. You could say, if you didn't think Alohi Gilman could play defensive back in the NFL, he was still going to get drafted because somebody's going to look at him and say, that guy is going to be a special teams captain for 10 years.
Ace.
And I think he can play safety, but I'm saying, like, even if you didn't, that was a guy that you thought somebody's going to draft him. Right. Julian Love brings some of that value. Troy Pride brings some of that value. I don't see that with Nick McCloud. I don't like saying it because, like I said, I'm really quite fond of him. I mean, he saved Notre Dame's defense in a lot of ways this year by coming over. I mean, it was, and I've never heard anything bad about him as far as how he conducted himself. But just this is purely a football thing. I just don't see a guy that I say that's an NFL football player. If Jalen Elliott's not an NFL football player, again, a draftable NFL player, then I don't think Nick McCloud is either.
Yeah, well, I hope for Nick's sake that he doesn't run a 4.8 like Jalen did.
Yeah.
But it's I mean, I'm right on the same page with you, Bryan. Like,
I heard. Speaking of, I want to interrupt you real quick. I talked to a lot of people at Notre Dame, but they were shocked by that. That is not what he ran at Notre Dame.
I was shocked too. I thought he was. I thought it was a mid 4.5 guy.
Yeah.
Like I was. I mean, he ran slower than Aloha Gilman. I could not believe that.
Yeah.
I couldn't. I couldn't fathom it
because he doesn't play that way. I mean, that was the weird thing. But no. But anyway, continue with your point about Nick. But that was just the weirdest. And it ruined what was an otherwise good combine for Jalen. I thought he looked really good in drills. But that 4.8, man, that's just that's that black mark on a DB that just that's not going away. So anyway, you before I interrupted you, you were gonna talk a little bit more about Nick McCloud and just sort of that projection and those kind of things.
Yeah, well, I think when you get down to the fringe draftable players into the UDFA, the guys that stick are the versatile players that can contribute on special teams. So we've kind of painted this picture here now that if Nick McCloud is a guy that is just a boundary corner, can't do much else in the defensive secondary, can't play nickel potentially, probably not a safety, and he doesn't bring a ton of value to special teams, at least none that we have seen, then how is he going to stick? At that point, I mean, I don't want to say that he might need to find another league, but like football might not be in the cards for him. Maybe he's a CFL guy. There's other developmental leagues that are, taking place. XFL is coming back for the 100th time. So we'll see if that is in the cards for him. I just think that not only is he a very long shot to get drafted, he's probably not a guy that has the desired traits and desired versatility to stick long term.
Right, because Dante Vaughn made it with the whole year with the Chargers, but Dante Vaughn was a much better athlete than Nick McCloud, in my view. I think Dante Vaughn with a different situation would have been a much better college football player without the injuries, and there was just some other things that worked against him. But there's a lot of NFL teams that were attracted to Dante Vaughn because they see 6'3" and athletic. Nick McCloud's just not that. He's just not that kind of athlete. And so I think that's going to hurt him. But I hope I'm wrong, and I hope he ends up getting picked and gets an opportunity to play at that next level and live out the dream that we all wanted to live out when we were kids, So here, wrap up here. We're going to do predictions. So we're going to go predict the round that you think the 3 front 7 guys for Notre Dame are going to get picked in. We're going to have you on again before the draft, so you're going to get a chance to kind of, as you do more evaluations and do more research. But this is just now. I'm not going to throw this back in your face on April 29th if it doesn't come true. But as of now, as of February 16th, your prediction for the range for where those 3 guys are going to go.
I think that Jeremiah is going to go in the first round. I would be surprised if he did not. Dalen Hayes, I think, is going to go somewhere in the 3rd round. I don't have much conviction behind that one as much as I do with Jock, but I will say that I think there is a reality where he's a 3rd round pick. Adi, I feel the same way. I think he's a late 3rd, early 4th round selection that is based more on traits than anything. He's not a guy that I think you're going to expect a ton of in 2021, but down the line. And then Nick McCloud. I wasn't including Nick McCloud, right? UDFA.
You can if you want. I mean, I didn't want to kick him while he's down. We kind of already. Let me ask you a question real quick.
Yep.
How does a guy like Romeo Okwara, kind of doing what he's done in the NFL, impact a guy like Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah? Adetokunbo Ogundeji, because both young for their age. I mean, I think Romeo was like 20 when he graduated from Notre Dame after 4 years. And he's kind of grown into being a pretty darn good NFL pass rusher. And he's a versatile pass rusher. He is kind of when you say, well, what's your NFL comp for Adetokunbo? It's Romeo Okwara. It's a guy that can play the edge, but also in nickel packages and in passing situations can line up over a guard and rush the quarterback. Do you think his success could maybe, do you see that like that sort of developmental growth where maybe in year 1, year 2, he's not a great player, but by year 3, year 4, this is a guy that Giants are probably wishing, I wish we wouldn't have cut that guy. we could probably still use that guy.
Yeah, I mean, Romeo has done obviously an exceptional job, and body type wise, I mean, they look pretty similar. Obviously, Romeo's a little more rocked up than Adi is currently, but we're talking about projection here, so I think that he could easily get up to the 270 pounds or so, 265 that Romeo plays at. So it definitely helps his cause because you're seeing a guy that came out of the same program, similar body type, that was a projection piece down the line a little bit, a younger player, like you said. So I think it definitely does play into his favor. I think it honestly, though, outside of just using Romeo as an example, I think that it plays into his favor just in general. When you map out where he came into Notre Dame to where he ended and just see kind of the stops along the way in general, that developmental moniker is going to get slapped on him a little bit because you see the progression year in and year out that a guy like Adi did have. And I think just in general, when you're talking about that position and how important traits are, that teams are going to get excited about that. And in a lot of cases, they're going to bet on the upside and bet on the long-term more than the short-term, turnarounds of what they're going to be getting. And honestly, in the third round and later, a lot of times that is the instance. First and second round guys are expected to come in and play relatively early. When you start getting into those latter stages, that's what scouts make their money is on late day 2 and into day 3. Like that's where they find those players that maybe you weren't expecting to make a huge impact, but that's where the projection aspect of the evaluation process really kicks in.
Ryan, I appreciate you coming on with me, man. I want to definitely do this again. I love talking NFL draft. I like talking NFL draft with people that know what they're talking about, and I've really enjoyed your work. We're glad to have you guys on board with us. So make sure that you are subscribed to the Irish Breakdown podcast, and if you have not listened to the Locked On Irish podcast, give it a listen. Ryan and those guys do a really good job. I've been on that show a couple times, and I would not go on a podcast if I didn't think they were good at what they do. So certainly have appreciated them having me on, and I appreciate you being on, and looking forward to doing this again. Make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel, subscribe and hit the notification buttons. And as always, check out irishbreakdown.com for all the latest Notre Dame news and analysis. So Ryan, thanks for having us on, man. We'll talk to you again soon. Now get back to the tape.
Will do, Bryan. Thank you so much.
All right, take care.